Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Big Baseball and Beyond, a D1 baseball podcast with myself, Burt Granger, and Patrick Ebert. Patrick, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great. Can't wait. Got a little taste of the warmer weather last week, and I know you're going to try to brave some cold weather baseball this weekend. But once you get that taste and you return back to Wisconsin and it's back in the 20s and 30s, it's really hard to go back.
Absolutely, and we'll get to your trip to the warm weather states, the sunshine states, a little later. But for now, let's talk about some of the recent action in the Big Ten. Some teams that have caught our attention in recent weekends. Number one, obviously, is Oregon. They're up to number 10 right now on the D1 Baseball Top 25. They swept Columbia over the weekend in dominant fashion, including a 35-1 shellacking over Columbia on Saturday. They won that series by a combined score of 70-15. So they had a lot of big performers. One of the biggest was Dominic Hellman. He's the junior designated hitter. He went 9 for 18 on the week with 3 home runs and 13 RBIs. And that included 2 grand slams in that 35-1 shellacking. Burke Lee Mabius. One, he's got a great name. I'm gonna rock with anyone named Burke. He was on our short list of Big Ten Freshman of the Year candidates. We just weren't sure if he'd get enough opportunities. Chase Meggers, who's been their projected catcher, he's been out. So Mabius has played almost every game for the Ducks. He's got an OPS around 1,200, and he's got 15 RBIs already. So keep an eye on him. He's an offensive-minded prospect with a lot of pro potential. And we'll have more on the Ducks coming in the coming weeks. They open up conference play against USC, and I think our own Stitchhead, Eric Sorensen, is going to be there for some of the action. So make sure you're following him for information on the Ducks. I also want to talk about USC. So they beat Fullerton in a midweek last week. They had wins against UConn and Vanderbilt this weekend. They did lose to UCLA, but they're now 9-2. The story for them was Caden Aoki. He was the Big Ten pitcher of the week. He went 7 innings against Vanderbilt, didn't give up an earned run, allowed just 4 hits and struck out 10. The pitching staff in general has just been terrific for the Trojans. Another Caden Hunter, he's 2-0 with a 1.8 ERA and 20 Ks in just 15 innings. Now their staff is leading the Big Ten in strikeouts and has a team ERA of just 2.91. And the pitching coach over there is a familiar name for me and probably a lot of college baseball fans. It's Sean Allen, who was a pitching coach at Texas for a long time. I think he was the one-time D1 baseball assistant coach of the year. The last 2 seasons, he was with Ohio State on Bill Mosiella's staff. And it looks like he's just done a tremendous job with that pitching staff. He obviously knows the conference, and the early results have been tremendous. Garen Rizzo is a sophomore reliever for them. He had 9 Ks and 4 scoreless innings of relief in a midweek game against Fullerton. His numbers have just been video game level good. Offensively, Ethan Hedges has kind of been leading the way. He's slugging 837 with 2 doubles and 2 triples, 4 home runs, and 16 RBIs. So a very strong start for the Trojans. They'll look to continue that this coming weekend. Another team I wanted to touch on is UCLA. So the Bruins are now 9-3 after a 2-1 weekend, which included wins against UConn and USC. They did lose to Vanderbilt. They have Maryland next weekend, and that's going to be an exciting series for those 2 teams in particular, because those were the first 2 teams we had out on our regional projections. We had them like 6th and 7th in the Big Ten. Shotgun Spratling will be there, so make sure you're following him. If you're at the ballpark, say hello. You can't miss him. He'll be the guy in the backwards ball cap, and he's wearing a tie. No one has more fun at the ballpark than Shotgun, so say hello to him. And UCLA's been another team that's winning with pitching, like USC. Chalowski and Lavu have been their guys offensively. They've accounted that duo has accounted for 9 of their 14 home runs. There's not a lot of other standouts in terms of offensively with them on the box scores. it's come on the mound with Wyland Moss and Ian May have been standouts. Justin Lee, he's a guy I mentioned a couple weeks ago in our podcast. He's got 7 short scoreless relief appearances so far this year. CJ Bott and Josh Algier have been 2 other bright spots in the bullpen who have not given up a run this year. I don't believe so. So we'll know a lot more about UCLA and Maryland, for that matter, after this weekend. Maryland's a really good offensive team, so we'll see if that strong pitching for UCLA continues against a very mature, potent offensive lineup for Maryland. So those are the 3 Big Ten teams that kind of stood out for me. Patrick, who stood out for you recently?
Yeah, there's 2 teams, and they're actually playing each other this weekend at US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. And if you may follow the Midwest coverage that we've provided in recent years, the Minnesota Golden Gophers, playing in Minnesota, they do have the luxury of that domed stadium there that is the home of the Vikings. They normally host what's called the Cambria Classic, the Cambria College Classic. And they've missed a couple years. Like, what was it, last year? I think they put new turf in that stadium. This year they actually had the Cambria College Classic, but they had a softball tournament with that same sponsor, and that was this past weekend. So it's a little bit different this year, but they're still playing indoors because Minneapolis on March 7th, 8th, and 9th is not going to be overly pleasant. There's supposed to be snow up there on Friday. So that would create a really nice setting. I do want to take an aside just before I get too much into that, just to say I do find it fascinating that we're playing Big Ten baseball this early in the spring because it's new to us, right?
Right.
Like, Burke, I know you're going to mention where you plan on heading a little later in the show. You mentioned where Stitch and Shotgun are going to be at on opposite coasts, covering some really good Big Ten series. But right now you look at the top of the standings and, it's Purdue sitting up there at, I think, 11-1. 11-1. And they're playing Minnesota. Minnesota's coming off a series win against Arizona State. And just before that, they beat Oregon State. So they have some really good, impactful wins. And Kendall Rogers did a story on them last week that I thought was really good. Talked about how their new head coach, Ty McDevitt, taking over from longtime head coach John Anderson, and the job that McDevitt is doing with a smaller roster. Like he hasn't been able to have the time to kind of like recruit and build from that foundational level, from the bottom up. And he's basically just doing more with less right now and kind of just building a new team. And keep in mind, like, Minnesota hosted a regional in 2018. So, it wasn't that long ago that they're that good. I don't think most people realize that Minnesota is basically, like, historically, not basically even, they're the Big Ten's best team historically from a success standpoint and the number of titles that they've won. I'm right now wavering whether or not I'm going to actually go see them play this weekend, but they have their ace is a young man by the name of Cole Selvig, who's actually from Northwest Wisconsin. So probably about an hour southeast of the Twin Cities. And he started his career at Texas, low 90s, kind of sinker slider type of pitcher. But he's really done a good job in that ace role for Minnesota. And really it's kind of the idea of just kind of like the team component that they really emphasize there. But then, like, Jake Perry, their third baseman, his first at-bat of the year, I believe he came off the bench and hit a grand slam. I think that was on Saturday. So, I mean, they're getting these big moments from these players at the key moments, really showing signs of turning that program around here. Purdue, on the other hand, like I said, they're currently in first place. Their head coach is Greg Goff. I think one of the most fascinating things I find with Purdue is their pitching staff has been so good early on. And this is 2 years in a row that their pitching staff has been pretty effective. And I don't think it's a coincidence that coincides with Josh Newman is their pitching coach, who was at Penn State, who was at Ohio State, who I'm sure you remember there. But he's done a really good job with the Purdue pitching staff since he's come over. Their second-year left-hander, Easton Story, is probably their top prospect. He's been pitching as I think their Sunday starter. He may have been bumped up to Saturday. At some point, he may continue to get bumped up because he's missing a lot of bats. But Carter Dorn's been their Friday guy, and Michael Vallone's been coming out of the bullpen and getting a lot of innings, a lot of strikeouts. And then, of course, Purdue, what they're most known for is their offense. That's what Greg Goff, that's his background. He's really aggressive on the base paths. They've already stole 24 bases this season. They're usually among the national leaders. Logan Sutter, one of their infielders, is absolutely just going off at the plate. He already has 24 RBIs this season. So it kind of gives the idea of just how hot and how well he's swinging the bat right now. So Purdue, kind of similar to what you mentioned with Oregon, they haven't really played anyone to this point in the season. Not trying to diminish the fact that they're 11-1, but they do need to play some competition before we start to believe, okay, is this Purdue team for real? Because last year they got off to a hot start. 2 years ago, I believe they started the year 15-0, didn't lose their first game until St. Patrick's Day. So for Purdue, it's just a matter of seeing, is this team for real? Because they're playing at a really high level.
And then I think you mentioned that's an insane amount of RBIs, and I don't think he's even first in the Big Ten. I think the Maryland catcher Cole Calarco, I think has
Alex
more RBIs.
Calarco? Yeah,
has more RBIs than him. So a lot of runs being scored in the Big Ten.
And all over, too. We're seeing that. You mentioned Oregon winning, 31-3 or something like that? And I mean, some of these scores that we're seeing, and there's speculation, of course, that the balls are juiced to help promote the scoring. But yeah, and I think that's just kind of fascinating all around to follow that story as we continue, and specifically into Big Ten play, to see how these teams match up with one another.
What about teams in the Midwest outside the Big Ten? Any teams that have captured your attention thus far?
Yeah, and that'd be Kansas for me. And coincidentally, they're also going to be playing at US Bank Stadium here in the next week. They're playing next Tuesday and Wednesday, a pair of midweek games against the Gophers. And not surprising, their head coach Dan Fitzgerald is from the Twin Cities area. He's from Minnesota. So I don't think it's a big surprise. He's a big hockey fan. So if you're a hockey fan in the Twin Cities area and you're looking to find some baseball with that kind of hard-nosed mentality, go watch the Kansas Jayhawks and the Gophers for that matter. So, but yeah, 10-1, it's kind of similar to what I just mentioned about Purdue, in that, Kansas hasn't really had that one stout opponent yet in their non-conference schedule. And, aside from Minnesota next week, it doesn't look like they're going to until they start Big 12 play when they open against Baylor. But still, you can't overlook the fact that they're 10-1. They're winning games, and they're doing it in all phases of the game too. So I think what's particularly fascinating is their pitching staff. They have a 3.21 team ERA, and their staff ace, who's Dominic Vegele, who was the Big 12 Freshman of the Year a year ago, his individual ERA is 7.36. So despite the fact that their ace isn't even pitching as well as he could and or should, the staff overall is having a really big year. As a team, they've hit 22 home runs. They're playing defense well enough to not lose games. And just overall, just playing at a high level, everybody is contributing. And if I do get a chance to get up there in Minneapolis this next week here, I'm really interested in laying eyes on them to see what they're all about.
Along those lines, another Big 12 team that's in the Big 10, that's in the Midwest, that has caught my attention is Kansas State, another team from the Jayhawk State. So if you remember, I think you covered them in the regional last year. They won a regional. They were a super regional team last year, but they lost a lot from that team. And they started out 1-4, and it looked like it might be a little bit of a rebuilding year for the Wildcats. But over the last 2 weekends, they've been one of the hottest teams in the country, beating a lot of quality opponents. Our own Aaron Fitt has had a lot of good coverage on the Wildcats at Globe Life Field 2 weeks ago, and then this past weekend at the Frisco Classic. So yeah, they're 5-1 in that span. With wins over Arkansas, who's might have the best pitching staff in the country. Michigan, who again I believe is a regional caliber team. TCU, Sam Houston, Nebraska, who we had favored as one of the top teams in the Big Ten. Their only loss came against number one LSU, so that's certainly acceptable. Maximus Martin, who's his Big Ten roots, he started his career at Rutgers before going to Georgia State last year. He's got an OPS over 1,300. He's got 4 doubles and 2 home runs. Seth Dardar is a grad transfer from Columbia who's hitting over 400 for the Wildcats. And then on the mound, one guy who caught my attention, at least statistically, I haven't seen him pitch yet, is Lincoln Sheffield, who has 21 strikeouts compared to just 1 walk in 18 1/3 innings. So if they can play like they had the last 2 weekends, there's a lot of baseball to be played in the Big 12 yet, but if they can play like they played the last couple of weekends, they might not be far off from where they were last year.
Yeah, and this is a team, like Kansas State got snubbed from the postseason 2 years ago. And I think Aaron Fitt has even talked about this as well. That team, I thought, was a slam dunk postseason team, probably was a little better than their team a year ago. And yet that team a year ago, I think, was playing with more of a chip on its shoulder because it wanted to show what it could prove. You mentioned, them winning the Fayetteville Regional, and I was there the day that they did, in fact, win that regional. And you could hear it from the coach, their head coach, Pete Hughes, and their players, just like they were really driven to show what they could do and given those opportunities. And, I talked to Hughes again in the fall when I did that fall report, and he talked about, the number of players that they lost, because they lost a lot from last year's team. It's almost a brand new team this year, but just the expectation is still there, right? Like they don't want to use that as an excuse. They still view themselves as a postseason team that has the potential to advance to the super regional round and even to Omaha. So far so good for the Wildcats of Kansas State.
All right, good stuff, Patrick. So that wraps up our kind of whip around action of Midwest baseball around the country. Now let's get into some in-person observations from you. You mentioned earlier at the top of the show that you were down in Florida at the DeLand Classic or whatever it's called. Tell us about, there was a couple Midwest teams there. So tell us about your thoughts on those teams.
Yeah, I don't even know if the tournament had a name, because even when I was writing about it, I looked on Stetson's site, and I don't think they called it anything other than the Stetson tournament. And I'd never been to DeLand, Florida, and it's about an hour north of Orlando, and like I mentioned before about the weather, the weather was really nice. It was nice to get into the warmth and the heat and weather that you actually can envision baseball being played. And a big reason for why I wanted to go down there was to see Iowa and Notre Dame participate in that tournament, along with host Stetson, who entered the year as one of the more intriguing mid-majors out there. But I'm going to start with Iowa just because I find them especially fascinating, just given the fact that I've seen them quite a bit over the past, 4 or 5 years, maybe even longer. And I covered them at the Terre Haute Regional 2 years ago when they fell just short of advancing to the super regional round, when they basically ran out of pitching. And when they ran out of pitching in that game, one of the last arms they used was Cade Obermiller, who is the son of Wes Obermiller, who's a former big league pitcher, pitched for a few different teams. I know he pitched here in Milwaukee with the Brewers. But in that game, Cade Obermiller was known for his arm strength, right? He had a low 90s fastball. He can touch higher than that in shorter stints. Really good slider. Like everybody kind of knew that. David Seifert, our D1 compadre, has seen him several times as well and has seen his stuff really good. But in that game, as a freshman, in a regional situation, Indiana State's bullpen was just on, or not bullpen, their dugout. They were just on him, and they were just jeering him from the dugout. You could hear it very distinctly. And every time he threw a ball, you could tell he got more and more flustered and just really had a hard time throwing strikes. But Iowa needed him. They were seriously out of arms. And even though he didn't have his best day, the next time I saw him then, which would have been last year, and I know you saw him too, he was that much better, right? He had taken those learning experiences. He had put in the work. He was throwing more strikes. He was sequencing better. He was sitting low 90s fastball, low 80s with a slider, also threw a changeup. And then you see him the first time this year, And that continued maturation process that he's taken and gotten better, it's notable. It's impressive. And he's now a legitimate staff ace. He was draft eligible as a sophomore a year ago. I think he was taken in the 19th round in the draft. And, you get to that point and like, I think everyone knew that he was going to come back. But more than the fact that whether or not he did or didn't sign, I'm glad he did come back because he needed that development time. And when I saw him down in DeLand, like he was such a different pitcher. Like the sequencing between his fastball and his slider had gotten so much better. The slider, and in fact, his slider has developed to the point that I don't even remember seeing him throw a changeup because he did such a good job to back foot and backdoor the pitch to right-handed hitters, really doing a good job to neutralize those opposite-handed hitters. They lost that game to Notre Dame 2-1. They lost it in 11 innings. But it was kind of one of those games that you saw that most of the times they're going to win that game because Obermiller just dominated. The next day, Aaron Savory came out, and he was throwing upper 80s, low 90s. Same pitch. His out pitch was the slider, like a big breaking sweeper that just completely stymied the opposing team. And he held Stetson in check for his outing, which was like 5 1/3 innings. And then I wasn't there for Sunday, but then they have Reese Buter come out on Sunday and do the same. Those three guys now, like if you look at their numbers, like the lowest ERA of the trio is 2.12, and the highest ERA of that trio is Obermiller at 2.12, and the highest is 2.20 for Obermiller. And they each have like 16, 17 innings pitched, 20 or so strikeouts. Like they have a really good weekend staff. The problem with Iowa is they're 4-6 right now. They lost 3 of 4 against Washington State over the weekend in Texas. And it's the bullpen and the defense and the hitters, like all the rest of it is so inconsistent. What Iowa obviously needs is to have more consistency. And I saw flashes of it when I was down in Florida. They could be a much better team for the simple strength of the 3 weekend starters. They get guys like Ben Dete, their left-handed closer, pitching more consistently. And Dete currently has, what's his number right now? His ERA is 11.81. Like he throws upper 80s, low 90s with a hammer of a curveball as a left-hander. And Burke, you and I know, like finding a true curveball thrown from a left-hander is pretty rare. A true 12-6 dropper where he just comes straight over and that ball just drops right in the zone or hits the dirt. And even that game, he came in the game that Obermiller pitched in the 2-1 loss to Notre Dame, and he gave up the eventual winning run, which was a solo home run. But before that, he was just lights out. He's going to be better. The other arms in their bullpen, guys like Anthony Watts, who has an ERA over 10, he's going to be better. Like, I just think as the season progresses, we're going to see a better version of Iowa. I mean, if we don't, they're going to continue to struggle, obviously. But I think they're better than what that 4-6 record indicates at this point in time.
Obermuller and Savory they're a great 1-2 combination in terms of amongst their Big Ten peers. And like you, I have a lot of history with both of them. And there were times last year, I think Obermuller grew up a lot last year because there were stretches where he had to be the guy for Iowa. And that was a rotation that included Brody Brecht, who was a first rounder, and Marcus Morgan, who's got pro stuff. Morgan is just a little streakier, and then Brecht was dealing with some ticky-tack injuries in the early part of the year. So Obermuller, this sophomore, who was a first-year starter at the college level, kind of had to carry that team. So I saw him in 2 starts last year, and he wasn't great, but he battled and was competitive and had to learn how to pitch with runners on for probably the first time in his career. Things like that, those soft skill intricacies of the game. He did a lot of growing up in those aspects last year. And then Aaron Savory, he was out of the pen last year when I saw him. And the first thing you notice is how much horizontal sweep is on that slider.
Yeah.
Like it takes an abrupt left turn when it's heading to home plate. It's a swing and miss pitch. But when you have an out pitch like that, the key is working ahead, obviously, and getting strike one over the plate. And that's where his fastball only being, I don't know what he was velocity wise for you, he was upper 80s, maybe touched 91 or so when I saw him in the spring and on the Cape. He was a Cape Cod All-Star. So, but those two will give you a good chance against any Big Ten team, I think, if the offense comes together and can keep them in games.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, you mentioned the slider for Savory, and they trying to figure it out on the screen. It started here and then it ended, here.
Yes.
Like it went straight across. And similar to Obermiller, he didn't throw a changeup because of that, because he used it so well against both right and left-handed batters. So, and like Buter, I haven't seen him yet. I didn't see him Sunday, but he's another guy that throws in the low 90s with good breaking stuff. And he had an elevated ERA last year. And talking to Coach Rick Heller, like they think they figured him out. Like they figured out like his stuff shouldn't be as hittable as it was last year. And so far through 3 starts this year, it hasn't. So it at least feels initially like he's taken that next step in his development as well.
Yeah. Then tell me about Notre Dame and what you saw out of them.
Yeah, I can almost copy and paste what I just said about Iowa, because it was the pitching staff that was really the most impressive part, and it was starting with the starters. And Jack Riddell, who was a freshman a year ago, around midseason, I want to say, was inserted as their Friday starter. He came out in that game against Iowa. He pitched opposite Obermiller. It was just the first game of that Stetson tournament, and gave them, I want to say, something like 8 strikeouts in 5 innings or something like that. Touched 95 in the first innings, settled down to like the 91, 92 range, and then just showed this much improved curveball, kind of like an overhand curveball, again, with that 12-6 break. That was really effective for him. Now, the problem is right now, like Riddell, as far as I can tell, is a 2-pitch pitcher, and he didn't sequence nearly as well as, say, Obermiller or Savory did. But he got away with a lot more simply because his pure stuff is that much better. Like his fastball is better. The break on that curveball is going to, confound a lot of hitters at least the first or second time through the batting order. Now, he didn't pitch this past weekend, which is always a little concerning. But like this season continues, they're going to lean on him to continue to give them innings. Jackson Denny's, who missed most of last year due to injury, is like the prototypical sinker slider type. He actually executed his plan like so perfectly through like 5 innings, and it was busting right-handed hitters inside, like in on the hands, like right below the hands with a sinker, and then he'd get him away with a sweeping slider of his own, get him chasing, and he did that for 5 innings, like with perfection. Like it was the same plan time after time. Only walked, I think, 1 batter in that game. Came out and had another good outing this past weekend. So getting him back in that starting rotation is a huge plus for Notre Dame. And then, again, I wasn't there Sunday, but then Rory Fox, who missed the first week, made his season debut down at that Stetson tournament. I believe that was a game against Stetson, and shut them down basically for 4 innings. I think he threw 4 perfect innings in that game. Best arm on the staff. Another guy, like I said, I'm really looking forward to seeing him pitch. He's actually from Wisconsin, and so I've seen him play infield and pitch locally here, but I haven't seen him throw yet at Notre Dame, and I'm really looking forward to. But other than that, like Notre Dame, like their lineup and overall, like this is head coach Sean Stifler's basically his first recruiting class on campus. So he's starting a lot of freshmen. I mean, Bino Waters is this giant football player playing like designated hitter for them and at the top of the order, just a monster. Parker Brustevich is their first baseman. He's actually probably been one of their most productive hitters through the early goings. And Noah Coy is their second baseman. He's a freshman. Jace Lee was a very talented recruit, I believe, from South Bend. So a lot of freshmen in that lineup. Not surprisingly, they are not hitting as well as they are pitching at this point in time. But they got a couple studs. Their catcher is a sophomore by the name of Carson Tinney. You can really tell by the at-bats he takes that he's going to be a special player. Same is true for Estevan Moreno. He didn't collect a single hit in the games that I saw him down in Florida. But I've seen him in the past, and I've seen him defensively too. Like now he's finally playing his natural position of shortstop, and he saves runs at the position, and he's such a dynamic hitter that when he gets that bat rolling, he's going to get hot and he's going to be nearly unstoppable. So Notre Dame, like Iowa, has some intriguing players. I don't know what their ceiling is at this point in time. I think there's some definite limitations for different reasons. For Notre Dame, it has a lot to do with their youth. I think that's going to limit what they can do simply due to that inexperience. You mentioned even simple things with Obermiller, like pitching with runners on and stuff like that. They're going to be going through a lot of those growing pains as the season progresses. But I will say this, I was impressed with the talent level that they have. And I think moving forward, Notre Dame is certainly going to be a team to continue to keep an eye on.
And you covered the Irish a lot in the Link Jarrett era. Was this the first time you've seen them in the Stifler regime?
No, I saw them last year too. I saw them play Pitt last year. And, again, it was kind of like they were good, not great. They had some good players. Moreno was playing second base a year ago, and you could tell that wasn't where he wanted to be. That wasn't his natural position. The pitchers, they had kind of pieced together what they had. I didn't see Riddell throw when I had seen them play last year, and they were trying to make more out of like their bullpen and just pull all those pieces together and kind of just, I don't want to say they fell apart down the stretch, but they had a chance to make the ACC tournament. I think they just missed simply because they fell a little flat towards the end last year. But yeah, I like the job. I like the job that Stifler's doing there. He obviously came from VCU, where he had a lot of success in a short amount of time at the mid-major level. And I thought he was a pretty good replacement from Link Jarrett, who coached at UNC Greensboro before coming to Notre Dame.
All right, Patrick. Great stuff as always, my friend. You mentioned that you were thinking about potentially going to Minneapolis this weekend to see Purdue in Minnesota. Do you want to tease the audience with what the other options you're considering?
Yeah, you want to welcome into my crazy world. So there's some storms coming down, and I'd gone back and forth because, Burke, as you well know, we like covering the Midwest as best we can. But I also cover the mid-majors, and there's a ton of action. Like UNC Wilmington is at Southern Miss. DBU is at Louisiana. And Tulane hosts like North Dakota State, and LSU is at home. So it's like this kind of perfect storm kind of within like a 4-hour radius around New Orleans. But right now I'm not sure because it looks like Saturday could be a complete washout, which wouldn't be good. As you know, when you travel, you want to have nice weather so your plans don't get completely derailed. And if that's the case, I may alter those plans and head up to Minneapolis and see Purdue, Minnesota, and then hopefully Kansas in one of those midweek games that I mentioned last week.
Yeah. Peek behind the curtain. Navigating the weather is really
in March.
March is one of the most difficult aspects of our job, because worst case scenario, Patrick could be sitting in a hotel in New Orleans. Maybe it's not worst case scenario with no baseball to watch, and he'll have to find something else to keep himself busy. But it's better. College baseball coverage is better when Patrick is at the ballpark. So that's why I want to make sure he's at this coming weekend. So
Isn't it funny though that like the safer option is Minneapolis?
I know that's
March
crazy.
7th.
Yeah.
Like that's because it has a dome, but still that's my safer option right now.
Yeah. So, side note, it was I think Coach Harden at Western Kentucky was complaining on Twitter about people spitting seeds on a turf field. And it turned into this dialogue of, well, you shouldn't have turf fields in college. You should be playing on grass. And those people just have no understanding of how many games would be washed if every ballpark was playing, if every team was playing on grass instead of turf. So turf is the reason they're able to get some of these games in. So just don't spit your seeds on the turf, man.
No doubt.
I'm going to go this weekend to Happy Valley, State College, Pennsylvania, to see as Big Ten play opens up. I've had this one circled ever since the schedules came out, of Indiana opening up at Penn State, two teams that are super interesting to watch. There's pro talent on both sides and good college baseball, great coaching, two of my favorite coaches in the conference, candidly. So I'm really looking forward to that one. It'll be my first trip there. Went to Williamsport a couple years ago for the Little League World Series, which is kind of in that area. And it got me thinking I need to make a trip to State College. So that's where I'll be this weekend. So I'm really looking forward to that.
What a fantastic week one matchup. You mentioned that two of your favorite coaches. Like you better prepare to give yourself like a lot of time to talk to those coaches because as you well know, Mercer can talk baseball for hours if you let him.
Mm-hmm.
And Gambino is just so intense. Like I've mentioned to you before, like if there's one person that could talk me into like running through a brick wall, of which I would just run into the brick wall, but still, if he taught me to try to do it, it'd be Gambino.
Yeah, I don't need to waste a lot of mental energy coming up with questions to ask them. It's pretty much
right.
Turn the recorder on, say, "Coach, how you doing?" And they're going to give me everything I wanted and more. So they'll make my job easy this weekend. It's going to be cold there too, so I'm hopeful that we're able to get games in. I think Saturday is like a high of 37, so we'll see how that goes. And
what's Friday going to be?
Friday is like 43, so I wouldn't doubt if they tried to play a doubleheader on Friday, like a lot of programs did this past weekend.
Yeah. I know Illinois and Michigan are playing down in Florida. They already planned that in advance, but I think at one point in time they were talking about playing that in Champaign, and I think a month or two ago they probably wisely decided not to play that anywhere near the Midwest. So
Coach Smith at Michigan has been very vocal about wanting to get the season moved back. So I don't think he would have been too excited about playing in Champaign this weekend. So he probably had a hand in getting that moved, and I don't blame him one bit. So
yeah.
All right, my friend. It was great talking to you as always. Thanks for being a part of this, listeners. A number of you reached out to us on Twitter, and your support means a lot for this podcast that allows us to do what we do. So thanks for riding along with us. On behalf of D1 Baseball and Patrick Ebert, my name is Bert Granger, and this has been Big Baseball and Beyond. Peace.